Hello everyone, Harry Baldock here, editor at Total Telecom. If the last year has shown us anything, it's that the value of connectivity in the modern world cannot be understated. We've seen operators thrown into the spotlight for their efforts to maintain networks as data demand surges, but it's really easy to forget that it's the submarine cable industry that really underpins our connected world. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Aqua Comms CEO Nigel Bayliff to talk about their recent acquisition, plans for the future, and the trends that are driving the subsea cable industry right now. Nigel, thank you very much for joining me.
Hi, Harry. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. Can you tell us a little bit more about the recent acquisition of Aqua Comms by Digital 9 to start off with?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, your opening comment that finally subsea gets its day in the sunlight, even though we bury these cables under thousands of meters of the water, is true. But I think it's true pretty much across the board in digital infrastructure, and that's the story of D9. D9, actually, the 9 comes from the sustainability goal number 9 from the UN, which is looking at appropriately priced connectivity globally. We were acquired by the D9 fund. They launched in March, achieved an IPO target of £300 million raised, and we were acquired. We were part of the IPO because it was intended to acquire us. We were acquired for $215 million, cash-free, debt-free, at the beginning of April. And I think just on Monday past, there's been an announcement for a further £100 million targeted raise for the fund. It's a trust fund intending to acquire digital infrastructure assets, the bedrock of the internet-style assets. And generally, those are in 3 main categories: data centers, towers, and let's call it wireless enablement, so 5G and small cell and all that kind of side of digital infrastructure, and then fiber. And strongly in the fiber range is the subsea assets. So we're the first asset to be acquired. We've had a great month actually since acquisition. We've closed a pretty major deal, and we've also launched a fairly unique product in the marketplace. So we're glad of the 4 or 5 years work it's taken to get Aqua Comms where it is. D9 have recognised that, and now we're looking to continue and deploy as we can.
I wanted to ask you about that actually. In terms of your the company's development and going forward, how does this acquisition impact your strategy?
But it doesn't change our strategy. Our strategic journey really pretty much continues as it was, which is growing in sort of 3 dimensions. So growing the scale of what we do. We started with 1 cable, and then now we have 2 cables live, and we have a 3rd cable going live next year, and we'll potentially have a 4th cable going live a couple of years after that on our, let's call it our home traditional market of the Atlantic. That's about creating lots of competitive choice for customers on our infrastructure as a service network. We'll also look at expanding out the breadth of our services. So the model that we put in place for running efficient infrastructure as a service actually, can be transplanted across many of the world's oceans and any of the other submarine cable routes. And given the, especially highly competitive nature of the Atlantic and the costs and the price declination, all of which are, fairly fierce in the Atlantic, moving out from the Atlantic actually is an even stronger margin gain for the company, because the general revenues tend to be a lot higher and the price declinations tend to be a little bit lower. So we'll then move out breadth geographically, and we've already started looking at a number of projects and opportunities to move from the Atlantic, down through the Med towards Asia, and potentially across the other side of the US and out in towards Asia from that side. And then there's kind of one other strategy that we've had for a while, which is just making it easier and easier to use the infrastructure. You talked about this being a key component of the world, making the world tick, especially in a pandemic situation as we've just recently experienced. What we're trying to do is make it highly efficient to use these superb assets. We spend many hundreds of millions putting these assets in the water and as a carrier neutral, highly neutral organization, we're looking to give access to them to as many people as possible, as easily as possible. We have a scalable model, and we're just trying to make a frictionless entry gate, if you like, to our network, so that people can quite simply just get access and ride on those cables to the destinations that they choose.
What exactly will the acquisition enable for Aqua Comms?
I think ownership by with a strong fund means access to capital. I mean, quite simply, that's the start. Is access to a wider pool of capital and a wider group of people who might want to invest in this type of asset. We also think that there's going to be significant synergies with some of the other portfolio companies. As they start to build up a stock of data centers in countries around the world, excuse me, Aqua Comms is in the job of connecting those countries via typically undersea connectivity, so that you can see there's easy synergies in maybe in operational costs or in market size or in all kinds of different aspects. Even frankly with the 5G, one of the things that I think some of these new access mechanisms are bringing to the networks is a delayering. So you used to have your local operator and your national operator and your international operator. Frankly, right now, from a London data center, which I'm there with my submarine cable, another portfolio company might be there with its radio access network, and the data center might be run by one of the other portfolio companies. So with three companies in the same group, you can get from the center of a metropolitan area like London to the center of a metropolitan area like New York, with companies that are all in the same ownership group. That's quite dramatic.
Let's turn to some of your recent projects. One of them, the America-Europe Connect 2 cable, which I think is often known as the have-through cable, became ready for service at the end of last year. Can you tell us a little bit more about the cable, why it's important, and your experience since service began?
Yeah, sure. Have-through is the cable. So that's the group of companies that came together to build that structure of the cable. AEC2 is what we call our portion of it and our piece of the cable. And we built that with some partners. But, we commissioned our trunk into Denmark just late last year, and we've actually already sold almost a third of the capacity on it. That's a route that was quite unique in the Atlantic and serviced by a well-known consortium cable, TAP 14, which actually almost fairly coincidentally at the same time decommissioned. So it decommissioned sort of middle of December last year, and that cable had been in service for something in the region of 18 to 20 years. So there was a surge of capacity coming onto the new assets. That's always an important thing. And as I say, we've deployed and sold about almost a third of the capacity on that trunk route into Denmark. What we've also done is our sort of structure of the North Atlantic is we created this mechanism, the North Atlantic Loop. Now, decades ago, we used to build loop cables that went in rings. Now we tend to build separate physical links. What we're doing is joining them together because it means an entry point like Newcastle or Denmark can give you two physical paths to North America, but from within the same contractual construct. So you can enter in Denmark and you can go across the North Sea, across to Ireland and onwards to the US, or directly via the AC2 path directly to New Jersey. That's important for people who are looking for ultimate reliability, because they want the two absolutely physically diverse paths for their data. The North Atlantic Loop. So we're quite pragmatic about our naming as befits infrastructure. We did one cable, America's Europe Connect 1, and the second one we called America's Europe Connect 2. And America's Europe Connect 3 will go live next year. So
you recently announced a successful 400 gigabyte trial across AEC1 and AEC2 into Europe with Telia Carrier and Sienna. Can you tell us more about that trial and what services you're now able to offer?
Yeah, I mean, in effect, that is a continuation, or it's a spectrum of services that will be enabled by digital growth. And what we see is these tend to come into play in the metro networks, and then in the long-haul terrestrial networks, and then finally into subsea. I mean, it is unique. We are the first to offer this. And you'll remember the progression, the 10 gigabit services, and then there was a launch of a mid-range 40 gigabit service, which was really only used between data centers. Then there's the 100 gigabit service, which is the typical pipe, large pipe that people use. Then we have 400 gig, and ultimately it'll be 1 terabit. And these are channels of, large optical bandwidth within which the customer can do pretty much what they want. So it again is driving this flexibility and innovative adaptiveness of the technology, and it allows our strong partner Telia, who helped us with that commercial launch and trial, and obviously our technology partner Sienna. But it allows somebody like Telia to put that into their IP network and write services across it at their own will, without having to call up and say, Aqua Comms, can I have another 100? They just simply open up a bit more of the 400. So that's always been a way to, make things more efficient for optical transport networks. And indeed, we're the first to do that across the Atlantic, to join 2 networks that can drive 400 gig with a subsea 400 gig. And one of the advantages we have is, of course, our assets are all fairly new, and they're built using coherent technology. And it's very, very difficult, if not almost impossible, to drive 400 gigabit channels, client channels, on the older era of systems that were built, 1999, 2000, 2001. So, it's a technological sort of step which will see those kind of stick with the older, smaller services, whilst the new cables come in, ourselves, the likes of Maria, etc., come in with these 400 gigabit services.
You're taking part in a keynote panel at Total Telecom's Subnet's EMEA conference later this year, speaking about the capacity boom and the drivers behind this increasing demand. Without giving too much away, obviously, what do you think will be the key areas of discussion at the event?
Well, COVID for us, and I don't mind referring to the pandemic, and everyone seems to not want to refer to it, but the fact is, our industry has existed in a time frame when massive technological changes have occurred. And the pandemic effectively was just driving another one of those a little bit quicker. Everybody's disappeared off to work in their spare bedrooms and trying to adjust now to a different style of life. It doesn't mean offices go forever and people only work in their hutches and never see a real human. But the fact that these big technological challenges are met quite easily by the very thing that we do, which is deliver, easy access to enormous bandwidth capacities. When I first got involved in this industry in 1987, the first system I worked on had an entire capacity, the whole cable, of 420 megabits. And we've just launched a channel on one of the fiber pairs of one of our cables that does 400 gigabits, 1,000 times that. So our industry has, really helped to facilitate, but also able to cope with some of these challenges. So, I'm always happy talking about massive growth, but we're just going to see even more massive growth. The folks in telegeography, probably 3 or 4 years ago, did a great sort of expose of the mathematical possibility of growth. And are we going to get to a capping limit? And I think, they proved that we'll all be dead 1,000 years before we hit this kind of limit of potential requirement. Because as humans, particularly in a remote scenario like we are now, we want to consume more of everything. We want to be video calling whilst we're cooking tea and talk to our loved ones who are separated, that we can't see physically once a week. We want to chat with them whilst we're making our tea. All of that is driving dynamic bandwidth onto the network. So I think massive, continued, sustained, enormous growth. And by the way, that also goes with storage at some point. Once you start to talk about the data creation, you've got to think about somewhere to put it, which is exactly why this strategy of data centers makes sense combined with submarine cable systems. And everything that is being done is, I just use the term, it's being cloudified. It's basically, it doesn't matter what I'm doing in a business, at home, in government, in anything, in education, academia, I want to cloudify it, because really what I'm saying is I just want somebody to help me handle all this enormous amount of data. I just want to use it. If I'm at home, I want to make video calls. If I'm in industry, I want to obtain insight from data that's somewhere stored in an enormous warehouse. But most of those things, most of consumer, enterprise, even the carrier market, even carriers don't necessarily want to handle their own data anymore, because they want to be good at the thing that they do. And this has always been part of our philosophy. This strap line we have as focus, fiber optic cables under the sea, it's what we do. And we're very good at it. And we don't mind saying that. We don't do all the other things, right? So we don't disfocus ourselves by thinking we can run our own, data storage, and we can run our own something else. We just pick this specific thing and try to be very, very good at it, and try to do that, for the benefit of a widest market. So I definitely think in our industry, we're seeing a structural change, and there are carriers that also do submarine cables, but they're becoming few and far between, actually. There are many carriers, I would say, over the last decade have, whether it's the phrase given up is the right phrase, but they have decided not to focus on that. The consortia of the Atlantic of 20 years ago contained names that you never see now in submarine cable ownership terms. And maybe that's a good thing, but I think it's all part of trying to cope with this enormous growth. We haven't even got into virtual reality yet. In 10 years' time, you and I will be sitting almost physically opposite each other. We've seen it on the Oprah Winfrey show, having a chit chat by the fireside, or, having a drink in a pub, all through, the magic of a headset. Well, that's about 6 or 7 times the required data for us to do what we're doing now. So, there's more sort of step changes coming along, I think. But the interesting one for me as well is this globalization factor, because people are not bothered now, I don't think, in general, as a statement, where something is done. So if I am a business and I'm using Salesforce, I don't need to know that data is in a data center just down the street, or on a different continent, or or out in space. I really am agnostic to how that. I trust the organization that's operating that for me to do it in the right places and follow all the right rules around data security, etc. But I don't actually care, and consequently that means data is shifting to places where it hasn't classically been before. And you look at the Nordics, and you look at the some of the Arctic regimes, where it's cheaper and less damaging to the planet, let's call it, to store and compute data, then that's going to drive a big move in our industry, particularly. That will be the place where these systems confluence together and hub to make use of the best natural environment. So somebody in Spain, where it's 35 degrees C in the summer, is having their data stored maybe up in the top of Norway, where it can be stored with less damage to the planet.
It's so fascinating. And I think all of this really leads quite nicely to the last question I have for you, Nigel, which is really about given this background of growth and a changing ecosystem, what can we expect to see from Aqua Comms in the near future, say the next 5 years?
The next 5 years? Well, I mean, essentially more of the same. We've taken 4 or 5 years, I suppose, 4 years to get to this point with our first Atlantic cable going live 2016. We intend to just, as I said, move that model across further geographies. So that's a continuation of that strategy, a neutral carrier. So we don't terrify somebody by saying, well, we're also trying to sell to your customers. We are simply carrying that transportation layer for them on a neutral way. We'd like to take that off around different destinations in the world. We also will continue to work with the large scale builders. There are, at various times, there are different parties who need submarine cables for their organic business, for their private networks. And we're working in conjunction with them to build some of these assets. We don't sort of go out and strike it alone and just build for our own reasons. So we'll continue to collaborate. We'll continue to develop a way of making this infrastructure available to as many as possible in as simple and efficient way as possible. So you'll see us potentially bring out, products perhaps which are easier to modify your requirement to use on the cable system, these so-called liquid services. And we'll also be looking to diversify our organization a bit around the world, maybe, because if we're doing things around the world, we'll need to potentially spread out from our Atlantic sort of core base. But all those are things that many of us in the company have done before in other companies. They're in our eyes straightforward, and now that we have a great owner and shareholder and access to continued expansive capital, then all of those things should be perfectly feasible.
Nigel, it's been really great speaking to you. Thank you very much for your time today.
If you want to hear more from Aqua Comms, the company's Chief Commercial Officer Chris Bailey will be joining the keynote panel session called The Capacity Boom, What's Driving Demand at our upcoming Submarine Networks EMEA conference. In addition, Andy Hudson, Aqua Comms Chief Network Officer, will also be giving an update about the company's current and upcoming cable projects. For more information about these sessions or the Subnets EMEA event, please visit our website, and we look forward to seeing you there.